Let's go ahead and make a C# console application. And the way you're going to do that is by clicking on File, New, Project. Now remember, when you create C# applications, the program that you're making is really a solution. That solution can be made up of one or more projects. And it's the combination of those projects together that make the program. So a solution can be made up of one or more projects, and that's what makes the program. And the reason we do that is because then we can divide up the work into a team, and multiple people can be working on it with different projects or even different classes, and then everyone can bring it all together into one big solution or program. So you said File, New Project, and we're going to do a console app. Make sure it's .NET Framework, not .NET Core. You want the .NET Framework. The .NET Core, that is the open source environment. And let's go ahead and give it a name. And I'm going to call mine My First App. Notice that I don't put spaces. I do like to use what they call camel case notation. Camel as in the animal, where I uppercase first character of each word. Now I could actually make the lowercase of the first, but I just like to uppercase first character. This is the directory where everything is going to be stored. You can change that if you want. I'm going to click OK. And make sure that before that you did have the Visual Studio C# selected, which ours was. You can go back and review that. It makes the brand new solution. Here's our solution. And then here's the project. And notice the solution said there's one project inside of it. That project is the same name as that solution. Now in our class we're only going to make one project per solution, but out there in the industry it could be different. Now within this class we have a bunch of using statements. These using statements tell the program, tell Visual Studio when it goes to compile the code or turn the code into something the computer understands, that it needs to go out and find this collection of code or this library of code, in other words, source code that somebody else has already written to help us get our job done quicker. So we need to use the using system. The using system collections generic. So this says go specifically to an area called generic in the collection statement or section in the systems file. This says go to the links section in the system file, go to the text section in the system file, and go to the task section in the threading section of the system file. Now the reason we actually are more specific is because this tells the system go right to what you need rather than bringing the whole thing in. You might think, well, this brings everything in, doesn't it? And it gives us a reference to it. But by us specifically specifying the pathway of the code we need, we can make our program run faster. Now you might ask yourself, but Brother Anderson, how the heck am I going to know if we're going to use link or link-q, however you want to pronounce that, or this section or this section? How do I know that? Well, you're going to see that throughout the course, because the system, when you go to write code, is going to pop up little light bulbs or warnings, and they're going to be able to help you. Notice when I do this, there's a light bulb right there, and that light bulb tries to help you out. So we're going to watch that later on in our course to fix problems that we might have. The next thing we have is something called a namespace. The namespace you can just consider a folder on your computer. For instance, when you're storing files out there on your hard drive, you usually create a folder. Now within that folder, you're going to have specific things. We're saying we want a namespace for our program, or an area in our program called My First App. And that's the same name as our project. Then we have a curly brace, because you have to have an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace within that namespace. So within the folder, we're now going to structure it, because we could have what they call a class inside of a folder, and you could have multiple classes, and we'll see this later on in the semester. So we're saying within that folder or namespace called My First App, I want an area of code called program, and we say that it's a class. Now a class, we're going to learn a little bit later, is just like a template or a mold, and we can make things out of it to help us get our job done quicker. In this case, we're saying we have a piece of code called program. And then once again, you have an opening and a closing curly brace. Within that program, we can now write logical pieces of code to go and do work. This is called a function. Actually, you're going to learn later on, it's called a method, but we're going to say right now that it's a function. And what does a function do? A function does work, or it does a process. And the word main, notice that M is capitalized, the word main in C# means something special to the computer. It says this is where you're going to start processing code. Or when you go to run your program called My First App, and once again this just says class program. We could call it anything we want though. I could come in here and change that, and I'm going to change it and say we're going to have a class called Greg. We have a function or a method called main, and so when we go to run this, the computer says, hey, does anybody out there have a method or a piece of code called main? And the class Greg raises their hand and says, hey, I have one. And the computer says, oh, thank goodness. Now I know where to start, because if I didn't have anything called main, I wouldn't know where to start. So when you go to write your projects, you got to make sure, number one, you only have one main. And number two, you need it somewhere out there that the computer can see it. So make sure there's only one main, and make sure you do have at least one main. Now these other things we're going to learn a little bit later. I'll just tell you quickly what they mean, and we'll understand them later on in the semester. Static says, I don't need an object in order to work. Now that probably went straight over your head. And if it did, don't worry about it. Void says, every function can give something back. And void says, for this function, main, I don't give anything back. You'll understand that later. And then when you see a parentheses, it says, I receive something to do my work. And so when the computer actually runs this main piece of code, it might pass it some information. And if it does, it's going to put it into this word, we call it a variable, called args. It's the pirate variable, args. It's the pirate variable, args, and it can hold string values. And it can hold 1, 0, or a lot of them. But once again, don't panic if that doesn't make much sense to you. Right now you need to understand that your solution needs to have a project in it. That project is going to have a class, and it's stored in a program.cs file, or in this case, we probably, since I renamed that to Greg, I probably should rename that also to be Greg to match it, or you could have just left it. Notice I just did a right mouse click on that. Right mouse click, rename. Or you could have just left it the way it was. Notice as I drill down, you're getting inside of that code. And the computer will actually try to take you to where it's at. For instance, when I clicked on main, Visual Studio, double click, took you right to that line. When I clicked on Greg, it took me right to that line, that class. Now within the main program, that's where we tell the computer what to do. So I could display something on the screen. I could say console.write hello, semicolon. Now, take a look at this. First of all, console. Console is a special word in C#. Console refers to your screen or to output. If you were doing a flow chart, anytime you had the word console, you'd probably have a parallelogram, a rhombus, because you're doing input and output. And a console allows you to get information from the keyboard, and it also allows you to write information to the screen. So this says, go to the screen and write the string hello. I know it's a string because it's in double quotes. If I put single quotes, that would say write the character. And C# would say, no, 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 not to my house. Because you can't use single quotes for multiple characters. You have to use double quotes. That's called a string. A single character is a char. and they use single quotes for that. Now if I ran this by clicking on the Start button, watch what happens. I click on Start, it builds it, or it compiles the code, tries to turn it into something the computer understands. It displays the screen and disappears. And that's because I said, go display it. But I didn't tell C# to stop and wait for anything. So what you do to tell it to stop is, once again, you say the word console dot read key. And notice I say read key parenthesis parenthesis. That's the syntax. Now if I ran it again, we're saying go right to the screen hello, and now go wait for the user to press something at the keyboard. So write displays on the screen, read key says wait for a key from the keyboard. I press enter, notice that it's waiting, and it processes the data. Now the other thing I could have done, watch this, // I've commented that line out. I could do this, console. In fact, I could press enter as I start to type in the word, dot, read, line, press enter, parenthesis, parenthesis, and let's see if there's any difference if I do a read line versus a read key. Once again, it's waiting. Enter, and it stops. Well, what's the difference between read key and read line? I'm going to uncomment both of them. So now I have a read key and a read line. And let's do this. Console.write what is your name? Question mark. Semicolon. Remember, every C# statement ends with the semicolon. So now we have console write hello, and then we do a read key. Console, what is your name? Read line. In fact, let's change this. I'm going to copy that text and paste it there. So we're going to have what is your name 2 times. And then we'll have read key and read line. Let's start it and see what happens. What is your name? I'm going to type in Greg. G. Wow, I only got the G in. And then it went ahead and said, what is your name? What if I press G again? Oh, now I can type in more than one character. Enter. So the difference between that read key and the read line, you might want to run it again, is that read key waits for you to press a key, a single key. Once you press that single key, it's done. It says, oh, I've got the key, I'm out of here, I'm running with it. Whereas the read line says you can type as many characters as you want until you press the enter key. Let me run it one more time and take a look at the screen. Do you notice what I don't like about this? G. It prints everything on the same line. I don't really like that. It jams the G up to the question mark and then it displays the next thing on the same line. So let's fix that somehow. How could I do it? Well, instead of doing a write, maybe we have something else. What if instead of doing a write, I do something called a write line? And I'm going to change both of my writes to be write lines. Now I'm going to run it again. Let's see how it looks. What is your name? First thing you need to see is the write line dropped it down to the next line. So in other words, it says write, insert a line. So it writes the characters, it writes the data. In our case, it writes the code that says, what is your name? And then it says, go to the next line. I could type in the letter G. What is your name? Now, once again, what's the problem? That read key is jamming up against the other text. We don't like that. So we need to somehow format our data and make it look nice. What I could do, if I really want to use the read key and get one line, I can actually tell the system to print a blank line. And I can do it either by saying write line, like that. Watch what happens now. G. So it adds a blank line, which is nice for us. Another thing I could do is I could use what they call an escape sequence, /n. Notice they're backslashes. This says, go write something out to the screen. Go write 3 blank lines. That's what a \n. Notice it's backslash, not /. Let's run it one more time and see what happens now. G, blank line, blank line, blank line. What is your name? Greg. So that's a way that you can clean up your screen and make it look nicer. And I could actually embed those /n's anywhere as long as it's within the double quotes. Another thing that you could embed is a \t. Let's run it one more time and see what happens. \t, tab. So that inserts a tab. So what you should have learned in this video, besides what the using statement does for you, which brings in code, a namespace organizes your data, a class says I'm going to start writing source code, main, that's where the computer starts executing, the console is keyboard and the screen, writeLine writes to the keyboard and does a new line, writes to the keyboard, or sorry, writes to the screen and stays on the same line. Read key waits for one key to be pressed. /n, enter a new line. /t, enter a tab. And read line, wait until they press the enter key. And that's your first program.